Welcome everybody. Today we are talking, this is a medical API hack session, talking about creating an FHIR app. If I'm not mistaken, it's pronounced FHIR. Am I correct, Kevin?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So creating a FHIR app for COVID-19 test results with Kevin Maloy, who I'm going to be introducing in just a moment here. Very quickly, to introduce myself, I'm Jacob Smith. I'm with a company called Altimetric, representing our Collider initiative with my colleague Ryan Robinson, who I don't know where she is on your screen, but say hi,
Hello.
Ryan.
I'm here and excited that you all are here.
So we're here representing the Altimetric Collider, which is a hub for software professionals, helping folks connect and grow. So we're the community-facing arm of a larger company called Altimetric, which is based in Southfield, Michigan, actually, for those tuning in from Michigan. We help companies with what's called digital transformation. So essentially helping big companies stay ahead of the curve with the ever-changing landscape of technology change and also sourcing innovation from within their teams. I encourage everybody, if you're interested in events like this, we host tech events all the time. We've got some coding tournaments and other things on deck, so please check out our e-newsletter on colliderdetroit.com. You can follow us on social media at colliderdetroit, and also definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we will not only be posting the link to this talk, but also where you can find other talks that we've given in the past and into the future. So without further ado, I want to introduce Kevin Maloy. So Kevin is notably an MD, as well as a software engineer, the only MD software engineer that I personally know. I don't even know if you might be the only one. I'm not really sure.
There are a few.
Very few. He's a veteran implementer of digital platforms, including AI, and specializes in developing interoperable health products, especially with the emerging FHIR, FHIR API technology. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kevin to introduce our topic in more detail and get started.
Great. Thanks, Jacob and Ryan, and thanks for hosting the meetup today. What I was going to do was go through some news that happened in FHIR since the last time some of us met up. Today we actually have some people from DC, Virginia, and Maryland joining, as well as some folks from Michigan. I kind of have this weird life where I'm kind of between both places. So some of the folks in DC, we've had these before, and I try to do like a little update for people who are kind of in the space about FHIR. So I was going to do that, but while I'm doing that, if you didn't already make an account at repl.it or code.cerner.com/developer/smartonfire, please do it. If you want to code along to actually make this patient-facing app that gets a patient's COVID results, if you want to do that, then make sure you have accounts at both of those. They're free. It just, kind of takes like half a minute to do, and it would be better to just kind of have an account so we can just kind of speed through. So in terms of updates in the FHIR world, if you have any updates for yourself, and I'm kind of new to the Zoom, like hosting this on Zoom and whatnot, and when we used to do this, it used to be more interactive, like people could say, oh, I'm working on this, or I noticed this, and if you have any news or updates and you want to mention them, just if you wouldn't, while I'm going over a few here, if you wouldn't mind putting it in the chat, then we could like unmute you and you could give an update, maybe something interesting medical API you're working on, or something interesting you found in the news. If you want to talk, that would be an opportunity to do it. So it's not just kind of like me talking the whole time, because this is really your group. So in terms of news and updates that I thought were interesting, if you're in the FHIR space, you may have noticed that Epic, which is one of the large electronic health record companies based out of Wisconsin, they recently updated their FHIR server. So they have a bunch of new resources about what information you can get out of an electronic health record if you're making an app for like a health system or if you're making apps for patients. It is a substantial increase in what they now offer. It used to be maybe like 10 resources or something, but now you can actually get information about the encounter itself in Epic, which I think is interesting because you could get like why that person or patient is seeing a doctor, which was previously unavailable. Another interesting one is the ability to create clinical notes. So if you're making an app for a health system, a nurse, a doctor, someone like that, you can now use the FHIR APIs and the normal Oauth 2 and stuff that web developers already know to create clinical notes that are first-class citizens in an electronic health record. Previously, you'd have to go to like Verona to like take a special class to learn how to do this stuff. And now with these APIs, you can actually create an app that lets a doctor create a note in the chart and be the note of record. So, you know, if you're in this space, I would strongly urge you to check out all these new APIs that are available from Epic. It's really quite amazing. I think it's gonna change a lot of the apps that people are developing. In terms of, you know, the other big behemoth electronic health record in this space is from Cerner. So if you go to FHIR.cerner.com, and you will notice that there's now the ability to make an app that gets information about that patient's diet, nutrition requests. So if they got ordered like a certain meal while in the hospital, that is now available. Likewise, service requests. So if you could potentially create an app that allows a patient to get all their ordered tests, like maybe they're ordered an MRI and they want to like shop around, and you create a way for them to do that. That would be in service request. And also medication request now has the ability to write information into the electronic health record. So you could create an app that lets a nurse document medications on a patient. So those are all interesting new abilities in Cerner's FHIR APIs. And you know, between Epic and Cerner, you probably have like 50% of all health systems in the US. The other thing I thought I'd mention is that Amazon Web Services just recently launched a serverless FHIR interface. And what you basically can do is spin up a FHIR server using API Gateway and some Lambdas. It's an interesting thing that Amazon is doing this, is offering the ability for people to, is targeting the healthcare field in creating FHIR servers. And if you want to check it out more, I would just Google building a serverless FHIR interface on AWS. I think it came out maybe 3 or 4 days ago. Well, maybe it was last year and I just didn't notice it. But anyway, it is there. It's good to check out. If anyone else would like to do some updates on what you're working on, I didn't see anything in the chat, but if there's anything you'd like to mention, I'll give you a second here to quickly enter it. If not, we'll move on to the main course in today's meetup. And I will take that as move on.
Looks like
So,
everybody is quiet.
yeah. So to create this app, what we're going to do essentially today is create an app that a patient can use to get their COVID test results. And these are going to be either a PCR. So the PCR is the one where they stick something up your nose and they swab you and they like turn it around. And then they put it in a little vial and they send it off. That would be the PCR that looks for active infection. And also IgG, so an antibody to COVID. So we're gonna create an app that lets a patient who may have just had one of those swabs of their nose or had some blood work drawn that got an antibody test, actually log into electronic health record and pull that result out. The information for how to do this is at patient.dev/COVID. Let me see if I can get it to open here. Basically, the way I set this up is it is a Google Doc that will be available for you to use even after this meetup is done. But what we're essentially going to do is walk through this Google Doc. You can also click on the Google Doc here, and it'll bring you to a little Google Doc page that has a bunch of information about how I created this app. All right. So hopefully everyone was able to get to patient.dev/COVID and come here. And you can click here, or what you could do is follow along in this embedded Google Doc right here. I am going to use this one right here because the links are a little easier to use. Okay, so the first step, so when you're talking about FHIR, what you're going to have to do is essentially have an app that is running somewhere. So you're going to have a server somewhere that serves HTML and JavaScript or something like that. And then you're going to have to register your app with a major EHR company such as Cerner or Epic. We're going to use Cerner today, but essentially to have a FHIR app, you need this web server that's serving out your code, and you need to have registered it at an electronic health company, so that electronic health record company, so that it actually connects to something, right? So the first part, in terms of creating this web server, what I like to use, and I get no money or anything from these people, I just like their product. I use REPL, REPL.it. So if you go to REPL.it, and hopefully you've created an account if you're trying to code along, if you go there and you fork this repo, REPL is very much like, kind of like GitHub pages, in that, you know, on GitHub you can create like a little website that's running in the background, and you could have people kind of connect to it. It's a little hard to kind of set up, but what patient.dev what REPL lets you do is kind of run this web server at its own URL somewhat transparently. So if you look over here on this side, this is actually the web page running at this URL here. So mine happens to be covid.patientdev.repl.co. But the reason we're doing this is this little spot here is its own web address that we can use to register this app in a little bit. You can actually open it in a new tab here, and you'll notice that now we are at that web address, and it is live and in sync with our REPL. So if we go over here to index.html and we were to change, if you are a patient, log in here and add a few exclamation points and don't do anything and reload this page, now we have 2 more exclamation points running on our website. The REPL link, let me see if I can get it for you. Let me see here. In the chat, let me see if I can do that. So it's repl.it at patientdev/COVID. All right, so what you're gonna wanna do there is fork the repo, all right? So when I go here, I'm logged in as myself, but you should see a little button here that says fork, right? And you can see it here. And all you do is click fork. And what that's going to do is change this address to your own web address, right? That you control out of these files and out of this HTML editor and JavaScript editor over here, right? It's important that you need your own little web server running to actually register your app, all right? So if you have forked that, we now have a web server that's up and running and can serve our code. So in terms of, like I said before, you need to have a web server, and then you need to have your app registered at an electronic health record company. We're going to use Cerner. So if you go to code.cerner.com/developer/smart-on-FHIR, and when this loads here, I will paste it in here in case you're, let me see, copy. Might have some extra things, but you should be able, that should work for you. So if you create an account at this address, and me, I am Kevin at patient.dev, and you log in, what you will probably see is a blank screen. You won't have any of these. This is an account that I have that has some stuff that I use to do different workshops and teaching sessions. But what you should see is this code console here. And it'll probably be blank here, but there'll be this button that says new app, right? So what you want to do is create a new app, right? So we will go up here and press new app. All right. So what you're going to need to do is give your app a name, and this will be some COVID app, right? And then it's going to ask you for a launch URI. So essentially what this is when you launch your app, it's going to say, oh, I am this app with this identifier, and I'm requesting access to get labs. The launch URI is the little web page that tells the electronic health record company, hey, this is who I am and this is what I want, right? So to do that, what you need to do is go to your REPL and go to your little web server here, copy it, and then paste it in here, and then add /launch.html. Because in this REPL over here, what I did is set up one of these for you. And if you forked my REPL, you should already have this file here. And it basically says, I am this app, and I am requesting allergies and observations and everything. And my redirect URI is this. Okay. And we'll get into redirect URI in a second, because it's the next thing. So what you want to do is just paste in your web server address /app.html.
Hey, Kevin, just a brief interruption. We've got a question in the chat. It says, could you also please describe the steps needed for a service, for example, no GUI? Yeah,
so FHIR does, FHIR works off of, FHIR has three use cases that you can use it in. One is there is a patient who's trying to log in. There is no headless, non-GUI GUI way to do that I'm aware of. It basically uses Oauth 2, kind of like the way that you, you log into Twitter, use Twitter's identity or Google's identity through Oauth 2 to log someone into your app. The patient access scenario only works with Oauth 2. The provider, like if you're a doctor, nurse at a health system, there's two ways to do that. One is with an app type provider, which you can see here on this code console. And the other is through something called system access. System access is basically like a super user, like you have a unique identifier for your app and like a secret for that app. That's only available to health systems. I do have a different workshop I do, and if people find that interesting, I do have a different workshop I do to teach people how to do that type of use case. It's different than what we're going to be doing today, though. But if that's something that would be of service to the community, happy to do that at a different time. But today's use case is just going to be it's just going to be this Oauth 2 thing. I don't have it live on patient.dev. I could get it up there, and maybe if you message me in Meetup, I could get up there and send you the link if you just message me to remind me. Cool. So for today's thing, where it's just a patient that's logging in, we talked about putting an app name, a launch URI, and a redirect URI, and that you need /app.html for this redirect. The redirect is basically when you launch this app, you're going to ask the patient to log into the electronic health record. Like if you go to Beaumont, it would be like Beaumont's My Chart, your username, password there. That the patient would log in to Beaumont, and then Beaumont would send them a code to get a token to access their information at Beaumont. And the way this works is that code gets sent to that redirect URI over here so that you can use it in your app. All right. So we talked about the launch, the redirect. The app type today is going to be patient. Cerner only offers a certain flavor of FHIR called DST2 for patient currently, so just keep that checked. We require Oauth 2, so say yes. Scopes, just keep them checked as they are. And then it's going to ask you for these scopes. And these scopes are what type of information your app is trying to get from the health system about that patient. So it can be allergies, appointments, binary, which is kind of like scanned documents in a way, conditions like ICD-10 codes, diagnostic report, which is kind of like MRI report, CAT scan reads, all that type of stuff. So there's quite a few things you can set up your app to get information about. The way I set up on REPL for this to work is just click everything on patient scope, just go down and click everything. So if you just go to read and click everything on patient, and just go click all those all the way to the bottom. While you're doing that, one of the frequent questions I get asked is what's the deal with user scopes versus patient scopes? So if you're a patient getting your own information out of Henry Ford, let's say, when you log into Henry Ford's patient portal with the app we're creating, what would happen is you would be restrained to query only your data, right? So that patient logs in as themselves, they only have access to their own data. They don't have access to like my data there, they only have access to their own data. So that would be like a patient scope. A user scope is mainly for like providers, such as like doctors and nurses. When they log in, they're able to query across everyone at that health system. So like an example of this is you could create an app that lets you, in which you need to pull up a specific patient. You could create a little autocompleter to start typing a patient's name, and then using a user scope on patient, which would be right here, you could then query for that patient and find that patient at the health system. So that's the difference between patient scope and user scope. Patient scope only lets that one patient, only lets you have authorization to get data on one patient, whereas user scopes let you get information about all the patients at that health system. One question is always, why do they have both if it's a patient app? And essentially, if you click all these and do user scope and you log in as a patient, it's going to essentially be a patient scope. You're going to be restricted to just yourself. All right. Yeah, so if you go down and click all those and then you click register, and let me catch up here. You will see something, you will get redirected back to the code console, and then there'll be like your app here with that name. And it'll probably say like this such and such app was successfully registered, client ID XYZ, all right? Does anyone have any questions up to this part? Because we're gonna switch over to REPL and kind of wire this up so it starts working.
There is one question, another question in the chat about the posting the link to the alternate workshop.
Yeah, yep. I just need to, I did that for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and I haven't quite made it out to that patient.dev website. So I will get it up there, and if Viraf just messages me in the meetup messages to remind me, I'll send him a link.
That's the only question I see.
All right. Okay. Okay, so the next step in wiring this all up is going to be to go to launch.html in REPL and change a few things. So here I am in my REPL, right? And basically this launch.html, when the patient's trying to access their information, what it does is it does this thing called FHIR Oauth 2 authorize, right? Basically, it's trying to do an Oauth 2 request. And this little thing called FHIR client, which I included up here, kind of takes care of all the OAuth 2 complexity for you, okay? But for it to do that, it needs a few things. It needs to know your client ID. So this is my client ID for the app that I have registered here. So what you need to do is copy that client ID, not the app ID, the client ID, paste it into your REPL here. The scopes you can leave alone. And you're gonna need to tell it the correct redirect URI, which is gonna be essentially your URL over here in your little web server /app.html. It needs to exactly match what you register in the code console for this to work. All right, so you could actually copy and paste it from the code console over there. I'll give people a second to catch up. All right. And once you do that on launch.html, you actually will have made this app that we will take a look at in just a second here. So to launch your app, what you need to do is go to REPL and just click that little open a new tab button. What you can do is click on this if you are a patient, log in here. And what that's doing is going to your launch.html here. And hopefully you'll see something like this. So this is the OAuth 2 screen to log you in to a health system, right? This happens to be a non-production fake environment that Cerner hosts. So that's why it says FHIR Play non-prod. Usually it would say something like McLaren or Inova or Hopkins or Beaumont or something like that. Epic's little screen looks very similar, but I chose to do this in a non-production sandbox that Cerner hosts, so that's why it kind of looks this way. In terms of simulating being a patient, what you could do is type in Nancy Smart in all lowercase. And I have this on the Google Doc here. It's Nancy Smart and Cerner with a capital C 01. Now this username password for their non-production stuff is public knowledge. It's on their developer forum as well as a Google Doc that they host about how you log in as different people in their sandbox. So this is not like some secret, this is very well known, and here's the links to finding that information, how to log in as this fake patient. So it's Nancy Smart, Cerner 01. And if you log in as that, what you'll do is see this little page and it says, your app, whatever you registered that app name as, wants to connect to Cerner and allow COVID Meetup to access, so mine is called COVID Meetup, allergies, appointments, documents, conditions, contacts, medical devices, all that stuff. Whose record you'd want to access is Nancy Smart because she has COVID stuff on her. One interesting thing I'll point out here is that you can create apps that like parents can use for their children via proxy access. And that's essentially what this is. It's like if you made something for vaccination, like a vaccination tracking app for Timmy Smart, you could actually have Nancy Smart use it via proxy access, and the way she would use that is log in as herself and then click Timmy Smart. But for this COVID one, we just want to log in as Nancy Smart and then allow access. What'll happen is you will be shuttled over to a little page at your URL /app.html, and you'll see a few boxes if everything works correctly. This one is coming from observation, and there is on patient 127240066, which is Nancy Smart, and it's a lab for coronavirus COVID-19, and it was detected, and that's abnormal. And it was August 23rd or 28th, 2020. And then there's another observation for the same patient for a COVID-19 antibody IgG, and it was detected, and that was on August 28th as well. Obviously, this is fake data. I actually reached out to some of the folks I know at Cerner to have this put in there, so I could do this workshop in particular. So it's entered at the same time. You probably wouldn't be testing somebody for active COVID infection as well as the antibody. All right, so I see some people got an error. So let me go back to here. So if you see this little box here, all right, seems like somebody may have gotten, I think the first person, Gunjen, probably got this one here where it says error, an application was attempting to request access to healthcare data in this environment. What happens is basically the solution to that is you just got to wait for a second because when you register an app in the sandbox, it takes like 5-10 minutes to actually propagate out. So if you hold on a couple of minutes and try again, this error will probably go away. And you just got to be a little patient with that. The reason I do this in Cerner Sandbox is actually better than Epic Sandbox. Epic Sandbox can take up to 24 hours to propagate stuff out. Whereas Cerner's is usually about 5 or 10 minutes. That error will go away. You essentially did everything right if you see that page. It's just that the app registration, there's a little bit of a lag time. It's not instantaneous. For the blank screen, I'm a little curious as to, I would make sure that you're not on my my REPL. So I would make sure that it's your own username / COVID or something else. And you might need to, if you hadn't clicked run, you might need to click run and then relaunch this. It's really hard to debug the blank screen. The other thing you could do is sometimes there's a JavaScript error down in this like quasi console area, which will say something. But the blank screen is a little hard. You may want to also open DevTools and see if maybe there's an error in that console. Like if you were to come over to here and open more tools, developer tools, and look over in console, you may see some error here, which might point you in the right direction, is my inkling. While we're waiting for these to propagate out, for the Cerner system to kind of catch up, I thought it was probably worthwhile, since we step through here and you see, oh, you know, there's some information here, like how did that all work behind the scenes? I thought I'd do that. And probably by the time we're done looking at some of the code, we will probably, your apps will probably start working, all right? So the code that made this is app.html, which we haven't really looked at. So the way I set up app.html, there's this thing called FHIR client, which we saw in launch.html. And it basically helps do the OAuth too. It can also make requests and stuff to the FHIR server to get medical data out. It was developed at Boston Children's Hospital. It's actually one that almost every startup that I've talked to actually uses. So it's very frequently used, this FHIR client. And if you just Google GitHub FHIR client, it'll probably pull up the one. It's from Boston Children's. There is a copy of it for one release over in this dist folder. But that is there to just kind of get some of the OAuth 2 out of the way, because that's kind of the hardest part of this whole thing. You know, I'm kind of an older coder, engineer type person, so I still use jQuery. I know a lot of people don't anymore, but I put jQuery in there, and I have Vue simply because I was trying to learn some new stuff, and Vue is one of those things you can learn. If you know a little jQuery, you can kind of just add little bits and pieces to your project and kind of get familiar with Vue, and kind of have some of the React type stuff, but not actually use React and not have to set up all the kind of skeleton you need to do for So style, there's a P tag, like a paragraph thing that just has a background of like gray, which basically gives us, you know, that light gray color here. And then the DOM itself is really simple. There's a div with the ID of main, and then there's these P tags that have the content itself in there. If you're not familiar with Vue, Vue has kind of this really nice way of binding JavaScript to the DOM, to the HTML, and it lets you iterate through stuff pretty easily. So this is a little loop that just says, for each entry, call it item, and then put the HTML as item.resource.text.div. That may not make a whole lot of sense to you right now. We'll take a look at it in just a second. But essentially, this is just some funny syntax that lets Vue just kind of iterate through a bunch of things. I have a little global called myapp. It's just a global object. When FHIR OAuth 2 is ready, so when OAuth 2 is completed and the FHIR client library has done its whole thing, then I do requests, okay, which is another function that's right below it. I do cache this client response with this response called client in myapp.smart. And it's probably worthwhile just taking a look at what's in there because it's pretty high yield. So if you go into your console in DevTools, you will actually get myapp.smart when it actually loads and it kind of propagates through the system. You can get the token response, which is actually a JWT. Those of you not familiar with JWTs, you can go to just look at jwt.io. You can take any JWT. You don't want to post stuff that's really sensitive here, but this is a sandbox account. So you take that goobly-gob stuff and it actually has information that, hey, this token, which we're using for our authorization, it has all these scopes like allergy and tolerance, all that stuff we checked in the code console, the conditions, the observations, the person. We're using, this token's using COVID Meetup, which is my app. Yours would probably say your app name. It tells who logged in. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there to get some information. So if things aren't like working correctly, sometimes if you look at the JWT itself, you can realize that the JWT for some reason doesn't have the correct scope. Like you're trying to get allergies, but you don't have that scope. The scope never kind of got authorized for some reason or another. So having that myapp.smart, that's part of the reason I do that and I cache this is so I can go back in and like still have access to that stuff that gets returned from the authorization server. So once OAuth 2 is all done, then we do these requests, and then I have a little do request function here. And specifically, the way that FHIR works is you can get test results by something called a LOINC code, which is like a standardized terminology that says, you know, a hematocrit is like number 258-2. A white blood cell count is a number 1234-5. So it's just a standardized way of talking about tests. I make a little array here for these two. And that's because the LOINC 94500-6 is the COVID PCR, or is at least one COVID PCR. Sometimes there are like multiple COVID PCRs, so there might be multiple LOINCs, but we're only looking for this PCR in particular. And this other one, 94563-4, is the antibody test. So what I'm essentially saying is that I'm going to be searching for these particular tests, and I make a little array that has those test names in it. If you're wondering how do I even look this stuff up, if you go to loinc.org, there's a way to search. So to get them, what I do is I do a simple fetch to myapp.smart.state, that server URL. So what I'm fetching is this URL. So if we go to my app here, which happens to be this URL, which is the sandbox, the URL for the fake data, the sandbox data that Cerner puts out. If I go to the observation resource and I query for patient, my app smart patient ID, and it's this patient, which happens to be the number that represents the patient who logged in inside of that electronic health record. I limit it to 50 and I say the codes that I'm looking for are this array joined with a comma. And I set the headers. You need to always have accept headers of application/JSON plus FHIR. Otherwise, it's a weird header to have, but you need to have it or all the FHIR servers reject it. So you got to edit the headers and say it's going to be application/JSON plus FHIR. And it's a bearer token. So we just put that token that we put in jwt.io there in the header. And once you get data, return the data. And you can actually see this if I'm still logged in. I think that I automatically got logged out because the token's only good for, there was a comment here. Review the login again. Yep. So if you go to here, because I got auto logged out, these tokens that get produced since it's health information are very short-lived. Usually they're about 10 minutes. But to log in at this screen, it's Nancy Smart, and the password is capital Cerner, so capital CERNER01. And it's also in that Google Doc at the end. And you would go here, click Nancy Smart, allow access, and to get my dev tools up here. And if we reload it, we were, before we got on this, we were talking about, oh, there's this fetch, there's this network request that goes out and gets the data. What does that look like? Well, here is what it looks like. So we sent a request to that URL that is the sandbox URL to the observation resource about patient this, about these codes. We get a 200 back. So it went through and we end up getting these entries. So this is line code, this entry has line code 94500-6, which I think is the PCR test, coronavirus PCR, and it's in LOINC. It is on this encounter. Like we talked about with the Epic's FHIR, they now have encounters. So now you could actually grab that resource for encounter. You could grab the encounter resource at this ID and get more information about the visit where this test was taken. The interpretation is abnormal. There's a standardized way of having test results too. Something called HL7, which is a big standards committee, has a bunch of ways to do this, and Cerner happens to use this standard to report abnormal results. Here's when it was issued. The reference range, it's supposed to be not detected. It's a final status. It's on this patient, which is who we queried for. And you can actually get the value that was generated, which was detected in value codable concept. So I go through all this, the network request, just to show you that, if you're making one of these apps, all the stuff gets returned in JSON. It's stuff you're already familiar with. It may take like, a few minutes to be like, oh, like the actual value itself is in value codable concept. That's, if I want to show that in a different way than what Kevin's showing here, I would put that value somewhere in my HTML. If I wanted to link to, or if I wanted to show the date in a different place, it would actually be issued. If I wanted to do what the interpretation is, I would use interpretation. So it's all really nice stuff. Like if you're just like a normal web developer, you don't need to know anything very special to actually go and start making medical apps. It would be nice to know the terminology, and you'd probably need somebody who knew what these tests meant working with you. But the data underlying this and the techniques of getting the data are probably stuff that you've used in the past on other projects, if I had to guess. It's just, part of going through this is just to show you that it's essentially a REST API with Oauth 2 that returns JSON. So that is that. So that is what I got today. Are there any questions, or hopefully I saw that Gunjan said that his error resolved. Await is only valid in async functions and async generators. Yeah. What I would say, I wonder what browser you're on. Is it Chrome? Because, let's see. App 45. It's probably something to do with right here, if I had to guess. Yeah. You know, part of the, when I do these meetups and workshops, some of it is always because I'm trying to learn new stuff. So one of my like missions this year is to get better at async await and fetch. So you do not need to necessarily have an async function to do this. You could, you know, put the result here, you know, like console.log this data here instead of return data, and take this await out if you wanted to. And then it would probably console.log out the data, and then maybe move this stuff up to there, and then it would work without that async function stuff. But part of the reason I actually set it up in this way is I was trying to learn more about async await myself, just because it seems like everyone's kind of using it nowadays, and I just need to get better. So.
Awesome. Any other questions, anybody?
All clear. So I will say on patient.dev/COVID, that's up all the time. And this Google Doc is up all the time. If you, you know, if you want to work at it or whatnot, none of this stuff is going away. So feel free to use those resources. And there's another question, which is, do other EHRs have similar resource response? Yeah. So one thing I did not mention is that if you take a step back, you're probably like, why? I always thought healthcare data was supposed to be hard, and like you had to take like these special classes, and it's all locked down, and there's this HIPAA thing, and you know, like it's really hard to access even my own data. Back at the end of Obama's administration, one of the last things that got signed into law, you know, what seems like a decade ago, but it was, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, was this thing called 21st Century Cures Act. 21st Century Cures Act did a whole lot of stuff, like funded stuff at the NIH and all this other, a lot of stuff came out of it. But one thing that came out of it was that electronic health records need to offer APIs for patients. So up until 21st Century Cures, there was really no public APIs for health data for patients. And 21st Century Cures legislated that if you're an electronic health record in the United States, you need to have these things. So it took a while, but over the past 3 years or so, the major electronic health records such as Cerner, Epic, Allscripts, they all came together in something called Argonaut that said, you know, like, what is this legislation that we need to have APIs? What does it mean? How do we do this? So they actually agreed on a standard to get data out of the electronic health record. And that standard became what's known as FHIR. So FHIR itself is kept up by hl7.org/FHIR. It has a few different flavors, but essentially you could check out hl7.org/FHIR. And if you're using the same flavor of FHIR, like that DSTU2 thing we talked about, that will be the same across EHRs as long as they have implemented that flavor. So DSTU2 happens to be in Epic as well as Cerner, and I believe Allscripts as well. The interesting thing is about 5 months ago, some regulations came out stating that by 2022, all EHR companies need to be on R4 flavor of FHIR, which is to say that if you start writing stuff at R4, 2 years from now, it'll be compatible across all EHRs. There's not going to be like an R4 style for Epic or an R4 style for Cerner. It will work. It'll be droppable into that EHR, and it'll work with the same. The responses, the APIs are given out will be the same across all of them, and the way you query will be the same across all of them. So the answer to the question is, there is a little difference right now, depending on which flavor you use. Within 2 years, there will be no difference. And it's probably gonna usher in, like the whole idea of Cures Act and the new regs is to usher in a new era of competition in healthcare, where patients can get their data out of the health system in any app that they want, made by anyone that they trust, to do new stuff with their health data, like compare prices for MRIs and stuff like that. So the other question is, does current implementation support US core? I believe it does. I believe it does, that profile, US core. Another question, all the resources for a patient app seem to be limited to read. How would a patient app get that data back to physicians? So that is an excellent question, and very observant. When we register the app for a patient, if we go to, let's see here. So when we registered this one, you notice that we only could read stuff. Let me see if I can get back to some other apps and maybe create a new one. With the Zoom windows, a little hard. But if you look here, there's a there's an app type called provider. So providers can actually write stuff in. So they can write conditions, they can create documents, they can create medication statements, they can edit patient demographics. Epic actually has some other write capabilities. Suffice to say that currently patients can't write data in. So if you wanted to do that, what you'd have to do is you'd have to store that data on like your own server somewhere, like probably in something that offers like a HIPAA compatible service, HIPAA compatibility as a service like True Vault or something like that. You'd have to store that data somewhere else and then convince that health system to put your provider app in there that could connect to your data store. You know, the main thrust of 21st Century Cures into registration was basically to allow patients to start to get their own data out, and the abilities of this stuff is actually going to expand over time, but this is like the very early times of FHIR. It'll eventually probably have write stuff, so. And well, we got 4 more minutes, I guess. We can do a few more questions if Ryan, is that cool or?
Perfectly cool.
Okay. Couldn't one create a questionnaire and have patients fill in details and could then be available to the provider? Yep, you could. So there is something in FHIR called Questionnaire Resource, which is supposed to be for questionnaires. None of the, well, Epic and Cerner definitely don't implement it currently, as far as I know. You could, create a survey and store that data in like your own database somewhere, which I would use something that has the security and stuff baked into it already, like Appable or True Vault, or I don't get any money from these guys, but it makes sense to me to use them. You could store it in another system, and then you could theoretically get the health system to implement your provider app, which then could connect back to your database. That's a big if you can convince a health system to like implement your app. There's probably a whole lot of rigmarole to it. But technically it's possible. What you're probably gonna see over the next couple of years, if I have to guess, is that ability will be part of the core offerings of the EHRs, this questionnaire resource, and that's just how it's gonna be. But currently it would be a whole bunch of rigmarole to actually get patients to fill in stuff and then somehow surface that to the provider. And Yitchen said, it was a Firefox issue. How do we read this test? What's the difference between risk level and risk level detail? Yeah, you know, I had the same question. The risk level detail, I was looking at that, and I guess the risk, I don't know if they have it correct in their sandbox, like what that even is. I think they just kind of added it ad hoc, this like, because I reached out to them, I said, could you put a COVID PCR and a COVID IgG in there? They're like, sure. So they just kind of like ad hoc did it. Result detected for, that is commonly reported, like when I see people in the ER with COVID, like if I send a test on them, and sometimes we get them back rather quickly if they're like really sick. Detected is how it is reported, and not detected. It's detected, not detected. And part of that is like the test itself, the COVID PCR, where you go in through the nose, like if you don't go back far enough, the person could have like the COVID in their nasopharynx and like the back of, you know, their nasal area. But if you don't push it far enough back, you're not going to get a sample that has it on it. So it would be not detected, right? So a negative COVID test doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have active COVID. It just means that when they stuck that thing in your nose and they pulled it out, they didn't detect any of the COVID like RNA on that swab. So I think that's why it's reported that way. But essentially means positive, right? Result detected. We can stick around for a few more questions. Jacob said, for those who need to bounce, you could check them out at Collider Detroit, which is a cool place. And the presentation will be on YouTube. Great. I have like 5 more minutes. So if you have 5 more minutes, I'll just go through these last remaining questions, which was Austin asked, does FHIR support the download of raw binary files, such as raw text results from a blood test on binaries generated from MRIs, x-rays? So I'm not exactly sure what you mean. So when I think about MRIs, I think about images and the report. So the image is like the black and white thing that you take a look at. That's usually a DICOM image. And then there's the report, which is the radiologist says, you know, like the cartilage looks fine and the bones are intact and there's no fracture, blah, blah, blah. If you're looking for the images, those are not supported anywhere in FHIR yet. They probably will be, I imagine, but they currently are not. I don't see in anyone's implementation. If you're looking for the results of MRI read, like the radiologist saying, oh, there's no fracture, the cartilage looks fine, blah, 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 that's in diagnostic report usually. And it's usually, sometimes it does come out as a PDF, which would be in binary. And sometimes it comes out as HTML, which is then just inlined in diagnostic report has been my experience. The blood test results, those will typically be an observation, which is the resource we use today. Gunjan said, thanks for your detailed answers. Could you also please share the Google Doc when you get a chance? Yeah, it should be on patient.dev there, but let me just see if I can just copy it in there. Oop. I feel like, let's see, hopefully that should be it. Can you recommend FHIR learning resources and meetups? Yeah, so you're at one, but the other thing is there's a YouTube channel for FHIR Dev Days, DEV-DAYS. Look for a YouTube channel. That's by people who are out of the Netherlands, I believe, called FHIR.ly, FHIR.ly, I think is what it is. And they have like people from big, they have this like twice a year conference where like people who are making FHIR stuff kind of talk about stuff. It's interesting to watch. There's a talk by Josh Mandel, who invented all this stuff, and like Graham Greene, who's another guy who invented all this stuff there. So if you're looking for stuff, that's probably your best resource for for FHIR stuff is the FHIR Dev Days channel. If you're looking for just like general coding stuff, like, oh, you know, like I don't know enough HTML or JS or something like that, you know, usually I don't know if the Collider folks have an idea about that stuff, but I usually use like, you know, the code school stuff, or there's like a lot of like courses online. That's actually how kind of I learned to code, was just by watching a bunch of videos online. And Lauren asks, I'm not a web developer, I develop iOS. I look forward to trying to create an iOS app, probably taking a stab at creating a web app. Yeah, there is a iOS FHIR client as well. So just look for iOS FHIR, and there, on GitHub, there's something you can kind of plug and play in. And great presentation, and oh, yep. And Dev Days, somebody put the link there. All right. Well, thanks, Ryan and Jacob, so much for hosting. I know we went a little over.
Absolutely. No problem at all.
And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
If you have an idea about, if you want to talk about something FHIR related or medical APIs related, you just reach out to me on Meetup, and we could do another Meetup. And if you guys want to present, or if you have an idea about something, just let me know.
Absolutely. And again, I posted the link to the YouTube, and we'll be following up with everybody with that link as soon as that's available. Thank you so much to everyone for attending. Thank you so much, Kevin. This session was awesome, and obviously so timely and great. So thank you for everything. And yeah, we really look forward to hosting another session with you soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.